All right, good afternoon. Let's get started. Our speaker next week will be Dr. Kiran Bakaraju, who is a senior member of the technical staff at the Sandia National Laboratories. He'll talk to us about interdisciplinary energy research at the intersection of computer science, complex systems, and decision sciences. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. and Professor Joanna, who is an associate professor of science, technology, and international affairs at the Georgetown University. She is a global expert on energy in China. Her work involves the intersection of energy, innovation, entrepreneurship, economic development, and innovation, and a lot of that is focused really in China. Her work has influenced a lot of thinking and policymaking in recent times. She has counseled and advised and consulted with many important bodies, including the Energy Foundation, the USAID. She has been a fellow also at many places, including Tsinghua University. She was a fellow with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And then more recently, she has really been the center of bringing in how the U.S. and China can actually cooperate. So as part of that, she was also a member of the National Academy's Committee on U.S.-China Cooperation on Electricity from Renewables. She recently was a lead author for one of the international IPCC Fifth Assessment reports. She has worked in many places before her position at Georgetown, including the Environmental Defense Fund, the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, the China Energy Group, and the Lawrence Berkeley Labs. So really, as you can see, she brings all of that background and experience now at her position, which explains part of how influential she has been in U.S.-China and energy issues. So please join me in welcoming our very special speaker, Joanna Lewis.
I don't need to use that. Okay. Thank you very much. That was a very too kind introduction, and it's really my pleasure to be here in Austin and having the opportunity to speak to you all today. The title of my talk is Examining China's Role in Global Clean Energy Technology Development, and what I hope to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to give you some ideas to begin to answer the following questions. These are really questions that motivate my research, and so what I'll be presenting today are sort of segments of different aspects of different projects that I've been working on over the last few years. So the question of how can China transition to a low-carbon economy, right? So this is a question that we all are thinking about. It's important not just for China, but of course for the entire planet. My research looks quite a bit at how China has acquired clean energy technology. So how exactly it's getting technologies that often were invented in other countries and then end up coming to China. And as we know, China is becoming a leader increasingly in manufacturing a lot of these technologies. I look at how China is contributing to green innovation, and are they, right? And what is green innovation, and how would we maybe characterize China's contribution to the development of new technologies that are being used in China and also will be increasingly important for other countries to adopt in the coming years as they make their own low-carbon transitions. And then finally, how should we cooperate with China on clean energy? A lot of my work, as was just mentioned, looks at how the U.S. cooperates with China on clean energy, how other countries are increasingly starting to cooperate with China, what are the implications of this surrounding intellectual property, surrounding political and economic motivations, and surrounding trade. So that's what I plan to talk about this afternoon, or this evening. So I heard you had a talk on China last week, which I'm excited to hear about, so I don't have to spend too much time on sort of background and context since you're all experts now on China's energy system. But essentially, when we think of China, you probably don't actually think about clean energy, right? You think about coal. And in fact, coal is still fueling about 2/3 of China's primary energy consumption, about close to 80% of China's electricity generation. So coal is not going to go away anytime soon, and I'm not here to convince you today that wind turbines or solar panels are about to, replace China's reliance on coal anytime soon. That said, there's a lot of exciting things happening in China that I think have really motivated a shift that we're seeing And one of these things comes from a transition that we've seen in how the country has become more and more efficient in how they use energy. And essentially we can measure this. One way would be by the overall energy intensity of the economy. So energy intensity would be energy divided by GDP. So essentially how much energy does it take to produce a unit of economic output, right? And China has become essentially, over the last few decades from, about the beginning of the opening and reform period through the beginning of the 2000s, China was able to see a declining rate of energy intensity. That this slope is actually steeper than any country was able to achieve during that period of their development. So what does this mean in reality? This means that if China's energy intensity had essentially been frozen where it was in 1979, 1980, and they hadn't become that much less energy intensive, China would be using 3 to 4 times the amount of energy that they're actually using today. And as you know, they're the largest energy consumer and producer in the world. So this relationship is important, right, because energy fuels China's economic development, and we want them to use as little of it as possible since they're using so much. During this period from 2002 to 2006, for the first time in decades, China's energy intensity actually increased. So this meant that they were actually using more energy than they had been using to produce the same amount of economic output. And I point this out because this really caught the attention of the leadership in China. This is sort of the exact opposite of what they wanted to be achieving. And this small little blip in this chart that I'm showing you here was responsible for almost all of the policies that were implemented in the 11th five-year plan, a very aggressive energy intensity target, which then paved the way for a carbon target and renewable energy targets, which I'll talk about later. You probably, when you think about China these days, you think about air pollution, right? And we hear a lot about the air pollution challenges that China is facing right now. This is actually some work that a student of mine at Georgetown did, looking at, whether or not the public, you're starting to see signs of the public really caring about air pollution in China. Of course, you walk down the street in Beijing. I was there for quite a bit of time this summer. Everyone knows what PM 2.5 is in China right now, right? I don't know if you walk around Austin and you start asking people what PM 2.5 is, if they'll have any idea, right? These are the small particles in the air that are causing a lot of the pollution we're seeing, particularly in urban areas in eastern China. So this is common language now, and you do see spikes in posting on Weibo. This is sort of the Twitter of China, when there are spikes in air pollution, people complaining about this, people caring about this. And as we know, instability is at the core of the concern of the leadership in China, and so anything that's triggering any kind of public discontent is of concern. And so I think air pollution has been an interesting instigator also for investment in clean energy and sources of energy that would be less polluting, not just carbon, for which we care about for climate change, but of criteria air pollutants as well. Now today I'm going to be talking primarily about clean energy. I know we're sitting in Texas, which is sort of the home of all kinds of energy, not just clean energy. But I think it's important to recognize that what we sort of call clean energy, I'm categorizing essentially renewable energy technologies, energy efficiency. Of course, some of these things are actually cleaner than others, and I'm just sort of lumping them together. This is no longer a small niche industry with like little bits of money going into it. $200 to $300 billion a year going into clean energy. This is new investments, right? And so when you look at what's actually being built around the world in terms of new electricity capacity, for example, as opposed to what's already in the ground, you see a lot of what's actually going in is, in fact, in this clean energy space. China and the U.S. are leading the world in terms of these investments. So you can see that in 2013, for example, China invested over $60 billion, the U.S. just behind, just under $50 billion, and both of those were down slightly from the previous year where they were still in the number 1 and number 2 position. So there's a lot of money going into the clean energy sector led by China and the U.S. A lot of my work has focused on wind energy in China, and a lot of people ask me, why are you looking at wind energy in China? Why is this important sort of from a global perspective as opposed to just within China? The amount of money actually that has gone into investment in the Chinese wind industry is larger than any single country has invested in any single clean energy technology yet globally. So this is more than Germany invested in its solar panels, for example, that it was installing there, or the U.S. has invested in any single technology we've deployed here. So the scale of this is really quite impressive, I think. So what is this all leading to? I started by saying that coal is still king in China, right? It's still extremely dominant. But I think this important shift that we're seeing is, again, it's about what is now being built in terms of new capacity, right? So if you look at the electricity sector in China, in terms of what is being built each year, so if you think back a few years ago, if you go back to 2006, for example, China was building more coal plants that year. I mean, China put in more coal plants in 2006, over 90 gigawatts. That's more coal than most countries built in their entire lifetime, right? This is a huge amount of coal. And you can see that in the blue is representing coal capacity installations. Over the last 3 years, you've actually seen that start to slow in terms of these are new coal plants being built in China. And so what's making up that new capacity, because we know the energy sector is still growing and demand is still growing, you actually see, still a lot of hydropower being used in China. China is one of the largest. So, they build a lot of big dams. You all know about the Three Gorges Dam. There are many, many other big dams still being built in China. But then you see the green and the purple and the light blue there. This is wind. This is solar PV, and this is nuclear. And if you add up all the non-fossil energy that was built in 2013, in terms of capacity, it was actually bigger than the amount of fossil energy that was installed that year. So this is interesting. This is the first year in recent history that China has actually installed more non-fossil energy capacity than fossil energy capacity. So again, you're not changing the mix quickly, right? You're still really small shares of all of these things. Wind energy, about 2% of electricity generation in China, okay? So still very, very small. But you're actually really changing what's being built in China, and I think this has important implications when we start to think about things like carbon emissions. For those of you who follow the climate negotiations, for example, or if you were following the UN Climate Summit last week, a lot of discussion about, what will countries announce in terms of their next targets? Will China ever start to announce a target which would actually require some kind of cap to be placed on their emissions, which is really tied to this question of, will emissions ever peak in China? So, will these charts that you see here, these curves, these are modeling results, studies that have been done by research organizations in China and the U.S., international organizations, of sort of their best guess of what's going to happen with China's emissions. And you can see that, these curves have all sort of gone up and up and up. And, just a few years ago, we were sort of assuming that this peak, so the sort of leveling out of these curves was going to be, 2050 or beyond. So, exponential emissions growth, maybe starting to slow, and maybe in 2050 we can start to think about a peak. But you now start to see scenarios coming out of China, groups like the Energy Research Institute, which is housed within the National Development Reform Commission, one of the leading energy policy entities within China. You start to see much more aggressive scenarios. So this is not just an academic exercise. These are actually scenarios which are helping to inform policy in China. And you see talks of emissions peaks more in the 2025 to 2030 range. From a climate perspective, this actually is a lot better than 2050. This actually gets us, into a range of what you might be thinking about to avoid some of the more dangerous impacts of climate change. And this is, of course, all linked to when will coal use peak in China, and will China actually slow or cap its use of coal? And there's a lot of discussion in China right now. There's been talks of soft targets on coal use by about 2020 timeframe, and so if that ends up becoming a hard target, which many think it will, then you can actually start to think sort of realistically about these emissions trends. Okay, are you all still with me? So that's sort of the big picture, okay? Now I want to move to what's happening so more specifically in the clean energy space. When we think about why China is doing what they're doing, I've showed you the investment numbers going into wind, going into clean energy generally. You might ask, what is motivating this, right? And I think there's a variety of factors that are involved here. One is the need to transition from an energy intensive, as I've showed you, They've done a really good job of becoming less and less energy intensive. A lot of this is due to the fact that the economy is changing from one that is almost entirely fueled by heavy industry, manufacturing, cement, steel. These are processes that take a lot of energy, right, and don't have a very high value added. They would really like to shift away from this, right, and this would require, quite a bit of effort, and you see a lot of policies and measures, aimed at trying to incentivize this shift. Clean energy is a part of this, and I'll talk more about that. The need to address air pollution, right? This is certainly part of this. I think it's probably not the biggest, instigator of clean energy development, but it's certainly up there, as is climate change. Again, probably not the biggest motivator, but certainly recognized as a contribution. Because the share is so small, it's not yet, an effective climate mitigation strategy in itself. I think one of the things we hear a lot about is that the renewable energy industries, which I'll be talking about today, have been identified by the government as strategic industries for development in China. What does this mean? China wants to lead in these industries, not just in China, but globally. These are industries that have been targeted for really building up technical capacity, building innovation, creating domestic champions that could compete in the world in manufacturing these technologies. And again, this is sort of linked to point one, right, about sort of moving into these more sort of next generation technologies, maybe higher value industries, and these sectors are very much a part of that. And then finally, I think this is, linked to the push to develop a more innovative society in general, right? This is language that we see in all of China's high-level science and technology plans. Much of China's technological know-how was really based on, acquiring foreign technology from a variety of ways. This is all very institutionalized in China's S&T plans. I'm not talking about IP theft through illicit channels, although we can talk about that. I'm talking about sort of official plans to actually encourage foreign technology cooperation. And they've been very successful and really, enabled China to, in many ways, leapfrog quite rapidly. Yeah, clarify. Yep.
There has been a lot of, innovative society, and we're trying to move from IT and service industry to manufacturing industry. That's the plan. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how that future is going to turn out in the next 20 years.
Yeah, we should talk about that later, because I think that's a really interesting reflection. So a lot of the clean energy development in China is incentivized by these high-level targets, right? There's a lot of very aggressive targets that have been set across a range of technologies, everything from hydropower to wind power to solar power. That solar power target of 15 gigawatts, so essentially by 2015, 2016, the end of the 12th five-year plan period, has been raised now multiple times. That target was 1 gigawatt as of a couple years ago. And it's now gone, 15-fold. It was actually less than 1 gigawatt before that, and that's partly reflective of what's been happening in the Chinese solar industry, as I'll talk about. Likewise, the wind power target was raised several times when it realized that the initial targets were far too conservative from what they would actually be able to achieve. And so you see in China clean energy support really being implemented across technology stages. So I don't know if any of you are sort of students of innovation or research and development, right? We sort of think one model being the sort of linear model by which, we move from basic research through development, demonstration, and large-scale deployment of technologies. China has sort of thought this through, again, from a science and technology perspective, and has thought about ways that they can, build their capabilities, not just sort of on the large-scale deployment side, which is what I think we hear a lot about in China, a lot of these big investments going into building out these projects, but increasingly focusing more on the sort of earlier stage research that could target higher risk technology, higher risk innovations, essentially, things that could be transformative. Things like the Department of Energy's ARPA-E program was designed to try to promote. A lot of these are all things that the Ministry of Science and Technology in China and related institutions are trying to develop, because I think this has been historically the weaker part of China's innovation system for clean energy in particular. When we think about promoting clean energy, one piece of this is related to what's happening on the climate policy front in China. And you may have heard that China actually has already launched 7 pilot cap and trade programs for carbon dioxide. I would have been probably one of the last people to say that China was going to be one of the next countries to implement a cap-and-trade program. This is similar to what the European Union did, to what we have in the United States at the regional level in the Northeast and California. This requires quite a bit of, I would say, not just sort of forward thinking about carbon pricing, but data needs to actually know how you set these caps, how you enforce them. This is all very challenging in the Chinese context, where you have this sort of, markets are still evolving in these sectors. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with these pilots. The idea of running these 7 pilot programs is that they will eventually help to set the stage for a national carbon trading program, which has been announced will be rolled out in the next few years. So I think this has been, this is something interesting to watch, and we can talk more about it if you're interested. So going back to wind energy, the story of China's rise in the wind power sector has been extremely dramatic. If you look at this chart, by the end of 2013, China installed far more wind power capacity than any other country in the world. The U.S. is second, although you can see that our installations were growing pretty rapidly, and crossed China's just back in 2009. Does anyone know what's responsible for that sort of slowing of wind power capacity in China by the end of 2013? Why it sort of fizzled off so quickly? Yeah, in the U.S., yeah. Yeah, the production tax credit expired, right, which was, really incentivizing a lot of our wind power development here in the United States. And so when that was scheduled to expire at the end of 2013, it really slowed a lot of the projects that were in the pipeline. China has sort of gone full steam ahead. And when you look at the actual market shares for who is manufacturing the wind turbines that are being sold globally in these markets around the world, you see that there's now several Chinese wind turbine manufacturers that are in the top 10. There are 3 Chinese wind turbine manufacturers which are, have made it to sort of the top 10 of wind turbine manufacturers globally. There's some here you might recognize, GE, Vestas. These are large companies that for a long time sort of dominated this industry. But the rise of Chinese manufacturers has, because the scale is so big in China, they're showing up in the top 10. Although, as I'll talk about later, they're not exporting very much outside of China. Within China, this is what the market has looked like. So essentially, if you go back, about 10 years ago, there were very few Chinese wind turbine manufacturers at that point in the Chinese wind industry or anywhere. There were, huge foreign wind turbine manufacturers that had the vast majority of market share in the Chinese market. Less than 10 years later, you see a complete reversal of who is selling wind turbines to the Chinese market. You see all these new entrants that are Chinese-owned companies that have entered this industry, and you see the foreign wind turbine manufacturers have essentially, their market share has dropped, has leveled out around 10% a year. Of course, the overall pie has grown quite a bit during that time because the total market has grown quite dramatically. But the foreign wind turbine manufacturers that were in the Chinese market were not very happy about this chart, right? Because essentially you had all these new entrants come in and take over their industry, and this has created a lot of competitive tensions in this market. I want to talk a little bit just about the dynamics of domestic wind development in China because I think this is not always appreciated. So, we hear about this rapid development. You may have also heard that while there's a lot of wind turbines being built in China, they're not generating as much electricity as they should, or they're not all connected to the grid, right? So these are a lot of things I think the U.S. media has picked up on quite rightly so. Part of the challenges that China's facing is that Inner Mongolia, which is in northern China, and particularly northeastern Inner Mongolia, is not only the province with some of the best wind resources in China, it's also the most coal-rich province in China. It's where you have a huge amount of wind being built and a huge amount of coal-powered capacity. And so the situation you have in Inner Mongolia is that you're trying to essentially integrate a huge amount of wind energy into an almost entirely coal-based electric grid. And so for those of you who are studying these systems, the challenge of this is that particularly these coal plants are not all that flexible. A lot of these are combined heat and power plants where in the winter you need to be actually running the coal plants to get the heat from the plants to be bringing them to people's homes to run district heating. And so you end up curtailing a lot of the wind electricity in China, in eastern Inner Mongolia, and you have a huge amount of electricity being put into this grid in eastern Inner Mongolia, instantaneous penetration on the grid. Wind power can get up to 80% of total electricity that's going into the grid at any given time. So essentially 80% of the electricity in this part of Inner Mongolia is being run off of wind electricity. There's not very many places in the world that are getting those levels of wind electricity going into the grid at one time. The grid company's job is to keep the lights on, right? Keep the grid stable. And so it can be really challenging to integrate that much wind into their grid, particularly with the somewhat inflexible coal resource. They can't turn these plants on and off very quickly. It takes days to ramp them up, ramp them down. So a lot of that is what's going on. You have a lot of wind that was being curtailed, but a lot of policies have been put in place to try to address this. This is just some data showing you that, Inner Mongolia is not only the largest coal-producing province in China, has the largest share of production, but also the largest share of wind power capacity and share contributing to its electricity. So this sort of creates this nexus of both technical challenge, but also political challenge. Because the grid company, this is making their lives difficult, essentially, that they are being told that to meet the National Renewable Energy Law, they have to integrate this wind energy into the grid. There's a system in China by which the provinces that are very wind-rich can essentially, do more wind energy and then help the other provinces meet their renewable energy targets that way. There's a burden-sharing mechanism by which all ratepayers in China are paying a surcharge, which goes into supporting renewable energy development, and that gets distributed across provinces. So in theory, they're being compensated for this, but that's not always implemented all that effectively. And so there's been a lot of money lost by wind developers who build these big wind farms, and then their electricity is not sold into the grid. And China has a feed-in tariff, which supports the wind power industry, and so you only get paid that tariff if you're actually selling electricity. So there's a lot of money that's been lost by essentially, developers that can't sell their wind electricity. The good news is this situation is getting a lot better. We see that in 2010, Inner Mongolia had 75% of the curtailment in China was happening in eastern Inner Mongolia, mostly because of what I was describing. But by 2012, 17% of all wind generation was curtailed, which was, again, a lot less than we had been seeing. And 2013, it's down to 11%. So you're getting sort of less and less wind essentially being curtailed, if I'm explaining this correctly, than we were seeing just a couple of years ago. Why? Essentially, really simple things are being done, like better forecasting. When is the wind going to blow? How can you predict that? How can you plan accordingly? So we hear a lot about solar in China, so I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the solar industry. Probably, when you think about solar in China, you think mostly of this pie chart here, which is that China is the largest source of actually manufacturing PV modules. So, the panel systems that we see, a lot of our panels here in the U.S. come from China. Really big share when you look at all the Chinese manufacturers globally. I think less understood is what's happening quite recently in terms of domestic deployment in China. So just as I told you in the wind industry, almost all of the Chinese manufacturers that are manufacturing wind turbines in China, those turbines are staying in China. They're feeding this, this huge growth in wind power that we're seeing in China. But in the solar industry, most of these solar panels were being exported outside of China until just the last couple of years. Starting in 2011, the government put in place a feed-in tariff for solar. So again, similar to what they did in wind, a subsidized price for solar electricity. And you suddenly saw this huge spike in solar development domestically. I've separated out sort of utility scale PV. This is like large scale central station PV projects versus distributed PV projects. Most of what's been done in China has been these large-scale PV projects, but just recently you can see that the targets for 2014-2015 are much more distributed solar. This is more what we do in this country, rooftop solar, for example. A lot of this has to do with the fact that what they would like to do is sort of avoid the challenges that they had in the wind industry related to related to integration, related to having a huge amount of great renewable resource somewhere very far from where you need the electricity and in a region where it can be very hard to integrate with the grid. So, for example, some of the best solar resources in China are located in Tibet. So if you were to just do this from a purely resource perspective, you would essentially cover Tibet in solar panels. There's a lot of reasons why that's probably not going to happen and probably shouldn't happen, right? And so the challenge is how can you actually put solar closer to demand? One of the real benefits of solar is that you can put it so close to where you need it. You can save the transmission challenges that you need, right? And so that's a lot of what they're trying to do now in China. China put in more solar last year than any country has ever installed in a single year globally. So pretty impressive, sort of the rate at which they're ramping up their own utilization of solar. So you may have heard about the various trade cases that are happening between China and the U.S. on solar panels. I don't expect you to read this chart. This is mainly to demonstrate that China is involved in a lot of trade disputes surrounding renewable energy technologies. But they're not the only country that's involved in trade disputes surrounding renewable energy technologies. We're actually seeing an uptick globally in trade disputes over renewable energy technology specifically. So I think a lot of this has to do with the numbers I showed you at the very beginning, where you actually see that the amount of money going into these industries is so large that there's a lot more at stake. And so you see countries doing a variety of things to make sure that markets are open. You also see an increase in protectionism in these industries. So, for example, one of the reasons why China was able to transition to having all these domestic wind turbine manufacturers that had such a big market share, as I showed you in China so quickly, is because a lot of their policies required that wind turbines used in Chinese wind farms were made in China. Okay? China's not the only country that's done this, though. Actually, we're seeing Canada do this. We're seeing France do this. We're seeing India do this in the solar industry. And we actually see the U.S. do this quite a bit, particularly coming out of the stimulus package in 2009. A lot of these Buy America provisions, again, to boost economic growth and clean energy is this, these are the green jobs, right, that we're all interested in. But the problem with this is that a lot of this really, causes trade disputes and conflicts with a lot of WTO and other international trade provisions. I have a paper looking at essentially there's a database where you can start to categorize all these measures that are sort of tariff and non-tariff barriers that countries are putting in place that could in any way affect trade, which could signal some sort of protectionism and affect the, sort of idealistic way that trade would flow freely, and you can see sort of who the main violators are, specifically in the wind sector, is what this paper looked at. So again, China's certainly up there, right? But it's not the only one. You've got, of course, a lot of the emerging economies. It makes sense. They're trying to build these industries. It's hard to get into an industry where you've got a lot of these leaders, and so you try to sort of protect your own local industry so that you can compete. Okay, so I want to turn to talking about innovation now. Now, when people study innovation, one of the first things they usually show you is data on patents, so I'm going to do that. I think that when you're talking about China, as a couple sort of disclaimers, I think patenting activity, anytime you're doing sort of a global comparison of patenting activity, you have to be really careful because, of course, we have sort of different national contexts for patenting and sort of what that means in terms of innovation, right? So the U.S., we have our own patenting system through the U.S. PTO. China has their own patenting system through the State Intellectual Property Office. Europe has their own, right? And then we have various global ways you can file in multiple countries at once. This is showing you U.S. Patent data over time, cumulatively. So this is essentially who has been filing in the U.S. in the alternative energy space sort of on, in net over the last decade or so. And probably not surprisingly, it's primarily U.S. companies filing in the U.S. in this space. But you see Japan and the EU also, very active. U.S. is sort of one place where companies file. Maybe they're filing there because they want to get into the U.S. market, or maybe they're just filing there because it's a very strong system for intellectual property protection. There can be a lot of reasons why you would do that for defensive purposes, for market strategy purposes. So anyway, these are the countries that you tend to see here. But then you see South Korea, you see Taiwan, you see China all starting to show up here, right? And these are really where you've got a lot of the emerging markets that are getting much more engaged, particularly in the alternative energy space. You find that depending on, this is looking now at a different source of patents, this would be the Patent Cooperation Treaty, so this looks more sort of globally at where patents are being filed. And you can see, again, you see Germany leading, this is specifically in wind energy now. So there's a few German companies that are particularly innovative, I would say, in their designs, and so hold far more patents than you might expect to see, followed by the U.S. Again, a handful of companies hold most of these patents. Denmark, the early innovators in the sector, Japan, right? And then you see China, not very far down that line. So, again, this is, I think, reflecting on the fact that patents are, they're valued differently in other countries, and so you have to take this with a grain of salt. But the fact that you even see China, showing up here at sort of number 6 in terms of global patenting activity in the wind sector, implies that there are some interesting things happening in terms of the innovation that these companies are engaged in. From a company perspective as opposed to a country perspective, the dominant firms in the sector still do dominate in terms of patent filing. So Vestas is the oldest wind company in the world out of Denmark. They still are filing for the most patents. GE, really relatively new to the wind industry in a historical perspective, but came in to own a lot of patents that a lot of the early U.S. firms had owned previously. And then you see Japan and Germany. I think Japan is interesting here, Mitsubishi in particular. Japan is actually the only country that has a leading wind turbine manufacturer and is a huge innovator in this space, but has not actually developed a lot of wind power technology domestically. It's the only country that you could say that about. So I think it's actually quite interesting to see what's happening now in Japan after the nuclear disaster in terms of looking to promote a lot of their own technical expertise in this sector, because they actually have it. They have quite a bit of it. And so again, you can actually look across technologies. This is again looking at U.S. patent data across clean coal technologies, carbon capture, solar and wind, for example. And you can see that China starts to show up in several of these categories, again, in sort of a number 5 or number 6 position. And again, this is in the U.S. market. This is not within the Chinese market. So it's sort of interesting, again, to see which sectors you see them moving in most rapidly. And the coal space, maybe not surprisingly, is one where they've really gained a lot of ground. So there's a lot of ways you can actually try to measure innovation, right? And I think patents is one, but it's certainly not the only one, and maybe not even the best one. And I think, partly the way that you choose to measure this is somewhat technology specific and sector specific. In the wind industry, sort of quick and dirty way to try to measure technological progress is to look at the size of the wind turbines that are being manufactured in a country. As you guys have probably seen, those wind turbines are getting much, much bigger, right? Over time, we now have very large wind turbines. One of the largest in the world is an 8-megawatt wind turbine that's being made by Vestas. This is for offshore use. They're doing this in Northern Europe. And you can see over time, this is showing you sort of the frontier firm in terms of who had the largest wind turbine sort of in production at any given time, or at least a prototype technology. And you can see that essentially, Denmark, Germany, Denmark, right? Sort of alternating between having the cutting edge. This is sort of interesting compared to the patent data, right? Because the U.S. is not showing up there. Meaning the U.S. has a lot of patents, but they're not sort of pushing the frontier necessarily of this technology. You look at the Chinese line, this is showing you essentially just within the Chinese market, how these firms were sort of catching up over time to the global size, largest wind turbine globally. And you can see that, if you go back to early 1990s, right, so like 1996, 97, there was about 600 kilowatt was the average wind turbine size being installed in China, while globally wind turbines being installed were well over 1.5 megawatts, right? So this is half the size, and those are really pretty different turbine designs in terms of sophistication. But now they're pretty close in terms of 6-megawatt wind turbine is a pretty sophisticated design. Again, this is for offshore use, and Goldwind, which is one of the more innovative domestic Chinese firms, as well as Sinobel. Large state-owned firm involved in the wind sector. They actually have this technology, and much of this has been self-designed, sometimes in collaboration with foreign firms. So, technology leaders must compete globally, and as I mentioned, there's, I think, a real difference in terms of how Chinese firms are sort of all within China. So if you look at sort of global market share versus number of markets, most wind turbine manufacturers in China haven't yet moved outside of China. From an innovation perspective, this is just important because they have less ability to absorb knowledge with deploying their technology outside of China. That can be extremely useful to these manufacturers, and essentially they're only within China. Very briefly, if you look at actually where their technology comes from, right, you have a handful of firms that are within Europe. These are essentially companies that I haven't talked about. These are not Vestas. These are not, your big manufacturers, but they've licensed a lot of technology to Chinese firms. And you see sort of a common set of companies that have actually been responsible for transferring a lot of technology to Chinese companies. So let me show you this like a little bit more clearly. There's 4 German companies, for example. These are relatively small, either engineering design firms or in some cases wind turbine manufacturers that have transferred their technology to multiple firms in China, emerging markets around the world, India. And this is, I think, interesting. This is another example of a U.S. firm, some of you may know, American Superconductor, which again has transferred technology to multiple firms in China, India, South Korea. I mentioned this again from an innovation perspective because you essentially have a lot of the wind turbines that are being deployed around the world. They're mostly being deployed now in emerging markets, and they're also coming from similar origins in terms of where these turbines were designed and where they were built. And so when we think about what that sort of innovation frontier looked like before and where this technology may be going, if it's now all kind of building off the same design, I think this is somewhat concerning in terms of how this could shape innovation going forward. So I want to just end briefly talking about cooperation. I think there's a lot of reasons why we think about why it could be useful to cooperate with China. We can help ease trade tensions. We can avoid protectionism. A lot of the trade disputes I mentioned earlier. Through better cooperation, this could potentially be diffused. In theory, R&D cooperation should actually speed the rate of innovation, right? We can sort of take the best expertise from multiple countries, get everyone together in a lab. The big if there is, how do you sort out intellectual property concerns, sort of other trust concerns that come from doing collaborative innovation. And I think, we have to think through what is the role of governments in facilitating this when it's not usually the governments that are developing these technologies. But I think we see interesting examples where governments can play an important facilitating role, particularly in a lot of these IP concerns that I mentioned. So, there's a long history of U.S.-China cooperation. Just last year, we signed a whole list of agreements with China on clean energy. This was sort of in line with when Secretary Kerry came into office in the U.S. and the change in leadership in China. And these all built on a bunch of agreements that were signed back in 2009 when the Obama administration came into office. One of these I just want to talk about briefly, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, I think is pretty different from all the rest on this list in that it's a much more ambitious form of cooperation. It actually involves 86 unique organizations from China, 41 from the U.S. Those numbers sort of keep changing a little bit. And the key thing here is that so they're cooperating across multiple areas. You've got the private sector, you've got universities involved, you've got research institutions, laboratories, et cetera. They're focusing on coal, they're working on buildings, and they're working on vehicles. They've all agreed to sign something called the Technology Management Plan, which is an IP agreement, which essentially sorts out who owns what coming out of these collaborative agreements, because they really want these scientists to be working together to develop new clean energy technologies. So I've done some work looking at, is this working, essentially? Does this technology management plan provide the assurances that you would hope to see in doing this kind of collaborative innovation? And I should say this is still pretty early in this project, so I think we may see more coming out of this. But what you find is that sort of across the 3 areas that are that the CERC is engaged in, you find a lot of patents being filed by the Chinese side, by the U.S. side. You see the U.S. filing mostly in the U.S. You see the Chinese side actually filing in both China and the U.S. You don't yet see any collaborative filings, so any sort of either jointly filed patents or patents coming from joint research coming out of the CERC. So I think that that reflects that they're sort of not quite there yet in creating the trust that they would need, that in theory this IP framework provides, and on paper it absolutely provides it. In the paper, I talked to a lot of the researchers, and they basically said, "This is great. We're happy to be involved. That's really wonderful. We have this, but at the end of the day, we're going to just sort of avoid anything we think is going to be sensitive in terms of IP because we still don't have full trust, right?" And you hear this from the Chinese side, you hear this from the U.S. side. So I think it's an interesting start, but maybe not quite there yet. But I think it's a really good first step, and I think there's a lot we could do with this. So to conclude, I think we see that, regarding innovation in China, the fact that you still have a reliance on foreign technology through licensing, through all these models, particularly in the wind sector, you see this in the solar sector too, shows that, green innovations are still coming, for the most part, from borrowing as opposed to invention, but progress is happening quite quickly. And I think that, this doesn't show that China's not innovative, right? Because you can certainly see a lot of signs that there is a lot of interesting development happening in these technologies coming out of the Chinese firms and with Chinese IP. I think there is some concern, as I mentioned, that we have an increasing over-reliance on common IP sources for developing these technologies. And in the long term, this could be problematic, and particularly as you actually see the deployment of these technologies happening farther away from where the innovation is taking place, because I think that interaction, that feedback has been really important historically. You also see this rise of protectionism that I mentioned, and I think this is potentially problematic for the industry. It's already making things more expensive. It's slowing global trade in solar technologies and other areas, and so I think this will be important for countries to work out, although it's, of course, quite complicated. We can talk about that if you're interested. And finally, on the cooperation angle, I think there's a lot to be done. I think the CERC is a really important first step. I think that there's a lot of room for continued cooperation, even in places where there are, competitive interests at play, particularly on just the operation and maintenance of projects, not on the IP transfer per se. What you saw happening in Inner Mongolia, for example, with wind curtailment, a lot of what's been essentially done to fix the situation has come from international experience, doing this before. And that's a form of technology transfer and know-how transfer, which is, I think, even more important than the hardware itself. And so I think we're going to see more and more need for this. I think the CERC, starts to lay out a way that you can do pre-commercial R&D cooperation and address IP concerns, but of course there's still, I think, a long way to go. So I want to stop there so we have a lot of time for questions. These are some papers that some of this comes from if you're interested in learning more about any of the things I talked about quite quickly. Otherwise, I look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you.
Questions? Hi, thank you for that talk. So I guess one first question really quick. What is IPR? Can you just answer that? Yeah,
intellectual property rights, sorry.
Okay, just making sure.
You should have interrupted me.
Yeah, and then I guess my other question is, you mentioned that there's a push to develop a more innovative society within China, and that's difficult with just the way that it's run from like a state and governmental point of view. Mm-hmm. What do you think is being done about that? Because you're also saying that there isn't much groundbreaking innovation. It's mostly borrowing. Mm-hmm. Is the government doing much to facilitate that? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, as I said, historically, a lot of the technology development has come, as you say, from borrowing or from, some way essentially working with foreign firms to acquire technology. And I think this makes sense as a so-called latecomer country, right? You don't want to start over, right, when you have technologies that have been, innovated in other places. There's a lot of models for doing that. But now with China actually sort of no longer satisfied with borrowing technology, the question is how do you transform to being a society that, as you say, is innovative in its own right. I can really only speak to the clean energy space. That's where I follow most closely, although, of course, there are things happening across sectors. I think there's a multi-pronged approach, right? So I showed you the chart that talks about how they're trying to support innovation along sort of the entire continuum, right? So this starts with basic research and ends with, kind of getting technologies out of the lab and into the field. And so I think in the past, China's been much more focused on let's get technology quickly to China and then deploy it quickly, as opposed to let's actually try to come up with the next cutting edge, breakthrough technology. And so I think they're not there yet, but there's a lot of institutions being developed, both through state-run science funding institutions as well as at universities. You see a real, push to try to create these sort of hubs, Silicon Valley type hubs in Zhongguancun and elsewhere to, try to actually encourage, startups and these more entrepreneurial type companies. But, as you say, it's not just about policies and funding, right? It's about a much broader culture of innovation. And I think that it's very likely China will have its sort of Chinese style of innovation that could be equally successful, right?
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. You just showed us the number of the trade conflicts. Yeah. And compared to the China's PV market share and the market share and the wind market share, the number it sounds reasonable, but to me it's also too much trade conflicts. So my question is that many countries have the government subsidies and the tax incentives to this new renewable technology, but why China's policy always cause so many trade conflicts? So what's your opinion towards it, and is there some problems or shortcomings of China's policy? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and I'd actually like to hear what you think about it. Maybe we can talk after, but I think it's a variety of reasons, and as you may be implying, I think it's not just about sort of trade conflicts and renewable energies. Often when you see a country launch a trade dispute with another country, it's not just about that technology. It's about like a broader set of political and economic interests, and you see particularly in the WTO sphere a lot of retaliation. So once you see, China launches something against the U.S. in one sector, and then the U.S. counters in a totally different sector, right? But they see these as potentially linked. So I think that's part of it. You can't necessarily look at these things in isolation. Why is China sort of causing so much focus? I think it's a variety of reasons, and it's a long answer actually, but and part of it is the way that the Chinese government goes about supporting these industries. It's not just that they're trying to be protectionist. Part of it is just the way the nature of a state-run society is established. And, when you're trying to calculate the way that the U.S., for example, calculates anti-dumping, margins for China, right, they essentially use proxy countries right? So if China sort of were a market economy, what should the price be? Which is great, but that's very counterfactual, sort of hard to say, right? And it's not that it's wrong. It's sort of the best they can do, maybe. But it's, it sort of leads you to a certain set of findings and assumptions. So I think that's part of it. And then I do think that there is a lot of protectionism in the Chinese industries. They're not the only country, as I said. And so, I think that you do have to look at this in the broader global context. Because I think ultimately, a trade dispute, whether it's sort of, China going after the U.S., or the U.S. going after China, or the U.S. going after India, or Japan going after Canada, it's detrimental to the entire industry because these are all connected through global supply chains. So putting a tariff on, Chinese imports to the U.S. actually affects, it percolates down to the entire industry, and it affects consumers, right, who are ultimately paying the pass-through price of those subsidies. Yeah.
Hi. Professor Lewis, thanks for so many interesting work. So I have two questions, sorry. So the first one is I have some difficulty in reconciling the two different voices. One is protectionism, and the other is kind of some collaboration on the R&D side, technology innovation. So what is going on on the U.S. side, particularly? So they're all focused on the manufacturing, not necessarily on the deployment side. So that's the first question. The second question is, how do you see the optimal model for U.S. and China to work together to push forward the technology change? So do you think they should cooperate on the whole continuum of the technology innovation, or one country should focus on a specific aspects of that focus on their competitive advantage?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great questions. Wow. Okay. I could spend an hour probably on each of those, so I'm not going to give you as full an answer as you'd like, but I'll try. I think on your first question about, the fact that you often hear the U.S. government sort of talking out of two sides, right? So on the one hand, we're saying, China, please transform to a low-carbon economy. Please cooperate with us on clean energy, right, and on climate change. And on the other, you see, well, we're going to put a tariff on your solar panels, and we're going to, right? And so why is that, right? I mean, there's obviously a complicated sort of political dynamic. These are different agencies, right? There's a variety of reasons why they have different mandates and different missions. But I actually think that they could do a lot better in thinking through a grand strategy, as it were, for cooperating with China, because I do think it's too important to have things that are sort of jeopardizing things that are as important as cooperation on climate change. And so, to your second question, I think that, I think a lot about this, and I haven't sort of have a fully thought through answer, but I think that there's a lot more room for doing real R&D cooperation with China. I think most of our cooperation has been at the far other end. It's been even sort of off the chart. So, more about sort of policy implementation cooperation, just sort of broader technical exchanges and policy exchanges. We're starting to, then you get sort of cooperations on demonstration projects happening more and more. We see that in the carbon capture and storage space, for example. And it's only, pretty recently in the clean energy context. We've been doing this with China for a long time, and in more of a natural science context, of course, but where you actually see this sort of collaborative innovation. And so I think there is a lot more room for that. And I think that, as you say, there is a lot of room to think about, as you say, competitive advantage, although I wouldn't quite put it that way, or, sort of advantage along the RD&D chain, right? I mean, there's a lot of advantages to, U.S. companies. I talk to a lot of U.S. companies who they have a technology, they think it'll be extremely powerful, whether it's a pollution control technology or whatever it is, and they can't find a place to demonstrate it in the U.S. They can't sort of get through. They can't find a company that's willing to pilot their technology. They go to China. They find a partner who says, great, we need this technology. Please try it out on our plant. It works great. Or, if it doesn't, they go away, right? You don't hear from them again. It works great. They then are able to show this to U.S. investors. They can get, pilot capital to then sell this around the world, right? And so you actually see China becoming a place where a lot of companies can demonstrate technologies. We have to be careful about doing that, so it's done sort of in a way that's safe and constructive to both sides. But I think that there are some interesting ways to think about sort of where are these comparative advantages along the R&D chain, definitely.
I have a question here.
Yes.
Yeah. This is to break the string of Chinese questions. So,
I like that.
And the question is about the impact of some of this protectionism in China and in other countries on the global innovation system. Mm-hmm. So the two examples that you mentioned which stand out is how over time wind manufacturing was more and more done domestically, and also how solar manufacturing rapidly increased in China, and a lot of that was exported. And this happens in different ways in different countries, and increasingly protectionism is creeping in, right? Now, a lot of these technologies are being developed in EU, in the US. How has this protectionism impacted that, not just looking today, but moving forward? If you're talking about transportation, if you're talking about biofuels, mm-hmm. How should firms and global leaders think about this and re-strategize, given that they now have a solid empirical case of this last decade, that, moving forward, they may not have the full market that they invested their R&D to prepare for this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. One way to think about this is if you look at where we've made progress in actually getting at these issues internationally, it's sort of not always in the forums where you would think. So, for example, in the climate negotiations, right, there's a lot of talk about how can we better facilitate technology transfer, right, and how can we sort of better facilitate collaborative innovation in these technologies. And, of course, that's a very tricky forum to actually talk about intellectual property rights and talk about these issues, because this is a forum where governments get together and negotiate very sensitive issues related to carbon targets, right? If you move into the WTO, you would think this would be also maybe a complicated political forum to talk about this, but you actually see APEC, for example, which is sort of a regional grouping of countries that have sort of common interests, common, in some ways, common markets in these technologies. We're able to negotiate essentially a maximum tariff that you could set on clean energy technologies to try to remove a lot of these sort of responses to protectionism, right? So a lot of the actual tariffs that have been implemented, for example, through the U.S.-China disputes, through the other disputes I mentioned, theoretically should be eliminated by the agreement that APEC came up with. And you actually see the WTO has now formed a group building off of the APEC decision to eliminate, barriers to eliminate tariffs on environmental goods and services. This is sort of a forum where I would have never thought they could make real concrete progress on this, but you've got a handful of countries all sort of getting together and, again, trying to negotiate this. This could sort of get at the protectionist piece by, having enough countries that come together and say, look, like, this is not actually in any of our interests, because when we sort of go after this in a piecemeal fashion, we're hurting globally, and we're not doing a strategic look at these industries. You need a multilateral forum to do that, and so the question is, I think, what forum, right? Is it a trade forum? Is it a climate forum? Is it, people have proposed a new forum, like a sustainable energy trade forum, where you would actually address this exclusively. The IEA could do it, right? There's sort of other ways you could get at this. But I think ultimately you can't sort of leave this to bilateral politics, right, as we talked about it, because it's probably too important. And then on the innovation side, I think it's a much bigger question, right, because, again, this is even much harder to organize multilaterally. I think the CERC, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, is a really interesting model to kind of springboard thinking about how could you do something like this on an even bigger scale. And the CERC is currently in a planning stage of sort of what they're going to do next. Are they going to do more technologies, or are they going to bring in more countries, right? There's a lot of discussion about this, because I think if you can actually get the IP rules right, then that opens up the door to actually, much more room for doing collaborative R&D. And so I think that's certainly on the table.
I just wanted to see if you could elaborate on your sense that the sort of non-exclusive licensing policy of some of the German and U.S. companies might be harmful to diffusion, and if there was any specific instance on the wind curtailment in which U.S. or other global firms or actors helped with either information or guidance on how China could overcome that problem.
Sure. I'll start with the second one first. I've been involved in lots of work, and this is not, so much my area of expertise. We have wind integration engineers sort of from all over the world have been in China, right, looking at this issue. One I could think of that is a really fascinating example. This is facilitated, I should say, by everyone from U.S. NGOs working on this issue to foundations to government organizations like the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado. All involved in this from the U.S. side. Denmark is very involved as well, and other countries with a lot of wind energy experience. Ireland, a country you might not think of as sort of a leader in wind energy development, but it's actually a country where you see a very coal-based grid with wind energies being integrated, and so there's some interesting research that we've been sort of getting those folks in front of Chinese researchers, and there's been a lot of interesting collaborations among postdocs and PhD students between some Irish and Chinese universities and research institutes that are building on this experience, essentially looking at, as I said earlier, coal plants are not that flexible, they're not good for integrating wind. This is the U.S. perspective, where we use a lot of natural gas, which is a lot easier in theory, right? But actually in Ireland, they have a lot of ways that they actually can cycle coal plants to make them more flexible and allow them to integrate wind. So there's been some interesting, I think, knowledge sharing there. That's just one example, and I think there's many others. And then on your other question, I think that if you sort of look, and this is something I'm still thinking about, but if a lot of the companies that I've studied that have, were the early innovators in the wind space, right, Vestas and others, even companies like Suzlon in India or Goldwind in China, you can trace their sort of IP history in terms of where it came from. Often they start with a foreign license, and then they sort of build up their own R&D capabilities. Maybe they move from a licensing model to more of a joint innovation model. Maybe they, go straight to mergers and acquisitions. They just sort of buy up other companies and absorb that IP and that know-how, right? And you can kind of trace how that knowledge gets built and, how that company eventually can do innovation on their own, as we were talking about earlier, right? And there's different models for this in different sectors, right? And in some technologies, it's less important to kind of have that know-how. In solar, for example, you actually see sort of full transfer of production lines. I was actually on the plane this morning next to someone who worked for a U.S. solar company that used to essentially transfer entire solar panel manufacturing plants to China, like the entire facility, right? You don't need then to even worry about sort of all the IP, like you're essentially transferring the entire production line. And so it's a different model in different sectors. But that said, if you can, imagine that a lot of the wind turbines now that are being deployed around the world, and they're mostly going to be deployed in emerging markets in the future because that's where the demand is, and they're all built off the same wind turbine design. Historically, we've seen a lot of failures systematically with new technology, right? And wind is no exception. A lot of the early Danish wind turbine manufacturers went bankrupt because of systematic gearbox failures that just wiped out the country because they couldn't go back and retrofit thousands of wind turbines. The Chinese, China's now deploying more wind turbines than any country in the world, and most of those wind turbines are like 1 or 2 years out of the prototype phase, out of the lab, right? So they don't have 20 years of operating experience. Like, we don't know, are they going to last for 20 years? Are they going to last for 1 year? Are they going to last, right? And it's not to say anything about Chinese technology. This happened in Denmark. This happened in Germany. This happened in the U.S. It's very likely there will be technology failures. And so if you've got, a lot of the wind turbines all being based off the same designs that don't have a lot of demonstration experience, they essentially went right out of the blueprint into into a 10 gigawatt wind farm. That's a lot of sort of sunk assets and a lot of question about, how that technology will perform. Separate set of questions about sort of future innovation trajectories that we can talk about maybe offline. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all.